start together. Okay, let's try to start together. Anybody here? Hello. Let's try to start together. The plan for today is that we're going to do the exercise first, because the exercise is a simulation. And so when enough people are all here, we're going to start the exercise. The men are going to go with me to the dining room, and the women will split into the usual two groups and stay here on both sides of the room. So until everybody's here enough so we can start the exercise, because we need everybody to do it, we're open for questions. Everything's been totally clear up until now. Everything about adolescence has been totally clear. Yeah.
I have a question on Hoffman.
Yeah.
The stuff you were saying to read.
Right.
I see this with very similar.
The section about today?
Yeah.
Yeah, or conflict.
The conflict.
Right.
So it's like similar terms, different terms, similar ideas, all kinds of.
Right.
Do they really matter?
Do the terms matter? Anybody?
Is there enough for me now?
Right. Has anybody else read, have people been trying to read these sections in Lynn Hoffman? I've been encouraging it, but it may be a singular question from a singular student. But I'll talk about terms in general. There are different, when you deal with something complex like conflict, and that's the topic that we're dealing with today, when you're dealing with something complex, one set of terms usually sees one side of the issue. If you think about a family, if you take one set of terms, for example, we learned the terms that Mediation uses for the subsystems, and remember that? Subsystems, hierarchy, and boundaries. It's one useful way to look at a family, because basically when you're sitting with a family, you say, how am I going to think about it? So if Mediation helps you, you use it. Will it help you all the way? No. So at some point you'll need some other terms to be able to understand parts of it that look a little different. Like you say, well, what's the differentiation in this family? Mediation won't get you there. He doesn't ask that question. If you start with differentiation and say, wait a minute, how are the functions of the subsystems? So the same issue comes up with conflict, that there are different terms that you apply to something like conflict. And different terms will express different sides of what you're going to see. So if you're thinking about yourself as a responsible therapist who wants to say, what am I going to do in the room with these people, then the more terms you get, the more you understand what the vantage point is and how to use them, the more confident you'll be. And the more you just have one set, you always start with one set. What we're hoping to do in this course is to give you a couple of sets of ways to think. Each of you, when you meet a particular family, will use different sets of terms. So is it required? There's no such thing as required. If you learn all the sets of terms that deal with conflict, you still will be short of how to use language to understand reality. Because language and reality don't overlap. Language approaches reality. Concepts approach reality. But reality is always much more complex. And so the more terms the better, and there isn't one that I would encourage you to give privilege to except mutuality. That's the term. So if you look, for example, at conflict, the term mutuality doesn't appear in the chapter in Hoffman, because the purpose of this course is to take Hoffman and add something to it, because you can read what's already written. So where would mutuality fit into conflict? All conflict is an opportunity for mutuality. All conflict. Why? Because there's different sides, right? There are different ways of looking at things. And you'll see that when two parents agree about the kid, except for one minor point about which they can't agree, which is which school, or whether he's more gifted or less gifted, or whether you should use a little more authority or a little less authority. And at that point of conflict, that's an opportunity for the two people to decide what to do with each other because they're different. Whenever two people face each other in their difference, right, and that's where conflict is, and it's an opportunity for them to understand each other's position and to create some sort of a plan about how to proceed and to look at themselves, if they're parents, how their child is experiencing their conflict, right? Because conflicts between parents are always pretty much, kids know right? You can try to hide it by speaking Polish or Yiddish or Ukrainian or whatever you want, but the kids feel conflict. And then the question is that something to hide? Or is it an opportunity to show your kids how you manage conflict? Because when they go to school, they're going to have conflict. When they're with their siblings, they're going to have conflict. And so conflict is not something that we want to shy away from. The question is how you use it, how you make use of it, and if you don't make use of it, what it does. So what we're going to begin with is an exercise in conflict that is difficult to experience, and then the experience that we have in the exercise will come back together and talk about the experience in the exercise. The exercise we'll do separately. The experience in the exercise we will do talk about together, and then go into some of the theory. I think we should start, right? Okay, so men go with me. So I hope you hated this exercise, and what we want to try to understand is what conflict feels like. Now, each of the characters, mother, father, and child in each of 3 families had alter egos sitting or standing behind them, right? So we want to start with the alter ego of the father. Who was the alter ego of the father here? Okay. Now, you were given, the father was given some instructions, which you don't know what they were, right?
Right.
What do you think they were?
Probably just to disagree with whatever.
So what's that?
To disagree with whatever the mother was.
Just to disagree with the mother, no matter what.
There was an alignment between the father and the child, but I don't know whether that was part of the instruction.
Okay. But for the father, it was just to argue, right? And who was the alter ego for the mother in that family? Okay. What was the instruction given to the mother?
I assume that the mother would pick her, her battle and stick with it.
Stick with her battle. Okay. Now we have a second family here. Who was the alter ego of the father? And what do you think was the father's instructions?
Just like stay strong in his opinion and like be stubborn and decide no matter what happens.
Okay, be stubborn. And the alter ego for the mother? Yeah.
Absolutely same thing with it.
Same thing with the mother, just stay with the program. Okay, alter ego for the father here. What were the instructions to the father, you think?
Keep the lights on.
Keep the lights on. And alter ego for the mother?
Just stick with what she's saying in one sense of urgency.
Okay.
The message goes.
Don't compromise. Right. So the instructions for the parents were very simple. The father was told, lights on no matter what, the rest you make up. And the mother was told, lights off no matter what, the rest you make up. Now, who was the father in the first? Who was the father? You were. And so what was it like to be the father?
I felt a little bit overwhelmed by the mother. I saw that the child was somewhat like identifying with my position, so I went with that.
The child went with what?
The child in.
I knew what you said, the child.
The child was on my side.
The child was on your side. And was that good for you?
Yeah, it was very helpful.
Okay.
In terms of triangulation. And
so you were grateful to your child. Okay. And the mother in that, yeah. And what was it like to be the mother?
It was pretty.
Just talk up so we don't.
It was pretty I felt like I was very strong and very unhealthy and very like tunnel vision, to do my thing and not seeing anyone else's feelings I can.
Okay, so in other words, father was feeling dandy and mother was feeling lousy. Okay. Father in the second group, what was it like to be the father?
It wasn't fun. Just kept doing the same thing, and
Talk
it wasn't fun at all. It was very just. I didn't enjoy just having to just keep doing the same thing again and again.
Right. You hated it.
Huh?
You hated it. Right. What did you hate about it?
It was just. It just felt stupid. I tried to go to Starbucks, but it
Okay. Okay.
Just keep going, keep going.
And the mother? Yeah.
I didn't like that the child was with the father. I wasn't sure why. He has to side the father. Maybe he should listen to me. Maybe he should listen
In this family, the child was with the father? Okay. Which group was that? Huh? You were the child. Okay, let's father. Okay, what was it like to be the father? Gabi had a particularly hard time because he was married to a lawyer. That's a little unfair, but anyway. Therapists and lawyers are different types, except for Gabi who's trying to do both. Yeah.
It was, well, I mean, I was trying to accomplish my goal, and in the beginning, my son took my side, and I didn't feel like I needed that, but as it happened, I felt kind of a release, and I thought that the mother would back down.
Okay, so you felt that it was like the other father there, that when your son was taking your side, that was a good thing. Okay.
I also felt that, you know, it was a little bit difficult because I didn't feel like I really had a reason.
What?
I didn't feel like I had a reason to keep my, you know.
Right, there was no reason. You guys didn't make up too many reasons.
It's hard to argue the point when you don't have a reason.
Right, okay. And the mother? What was it like to be the mother?
The fact that the kid was early aligned with his father wasn't easy in the sense that I didn't want to triangulate him into something, and I tried to talk to the father directly,
Right.
and he didn't have a reason to do so, which made it more frustrating.
Okay.
The kid didn't have a reason either, which actually maybe made it easier, because it's not like he said, he just said, I just want to know.
Okay.
So I didn't feel like, if he's not scared, if it's not something, and then, you know, being a lawyer, I offered a compromise, that we read him a story, and
Right.
thinking them lights would be off. And a lot of that kind of went on to that later.
Right. Being a lawyer, he doesn't take orders, because that wasn't what I told you to do. No
But the
compromise.
light would be off.
Right. Yeah, we'll get the compromise in a minute. Okay, now the child of group, the first group. Okay, now who was your alter ego?
We didn't have enough people.
We didn't have enough people. Okay, so then you can say, what was it like to be that child?
So I can identify with Shira. It was very repetitive and I didn't enjoy it. It was also hard for me to stay a child and do childlike behaviors and not like talk out. I was scared in the dark and happy in the light, so it was hard for me to act it out versus like talk it.
Okay, so you were acting out the illness? The role that you were given was?
Meaning to be child versus adolescent. So it was hard for me to do childlike behaviors
Right.
and not adolescent-like behaviors.
And it was to stay with the child. And the
Yeah.
role that you were given was?
To act one way in the light and act a different way in the dark.
Right, to act ill, right? Or just to act differently?
I was to choose how to act in each situation.
Okay, and you didn't have an alter ego. The father and the mother in that group, did they understand that that was the child's role? Who was the mother in this
Yeah.
group? That you understood that?
That she's supposed to act different when it comes on.
Right, and how did you understand why she's acting differently in the light and in the dark?
Well, as a mother who is one way, I was saying that it's unhealthy. It's like for my child to just like toughen up, and she has to learn how to be afraid. Even we have to work through her fear, going to light off. And the father is very triangulated because then the father is saying
Okay.
she needs the light on to be able to work out.
Who was the father?
Me.
Yeah. Who?
Right, so I played the part of she needs the light on to calm her fears so that you could talk to her so she could work on not being afraid of the light being off.
Right. Now, how did you guessed that your daughter's role was to be on your side, right? That isn't what you were told, right? So how did that come about that you ended up on father's side?
Well, because I was happy in the light and
Right.
dad
and
was.
I felt
Oh, you were
Going
happy in
on.
the light. Okay, that was a bit of a problem. Okay, we'll get to that. The second family, you were the child, and you had an alter ego. What was her role?
I thought it was just to align with the father and whatever he did, whatever he said, she should agree with him.
Okay, that was the role, right? And what was it like to be in that role?
I felt mean to the mother. And
What's that?
I felt very mean to the mother because I was just like, Daddy's right, Mummy's stupid. and, I mean, also, I think that unlike the story with the light, it wasn't about the child. The child was just there in the room, but it was about the parents.
Okay.
Like who wanted the coffee machine on and who wanted it off. So I just felt like it was interfering, you know, and like this isn't really anything to do with me, but the more I got involved and being on the father's side, the more I felt like, well, I was thinking maybe, you know, maybe this is to do with me, maybe, you know, as a child I was thinking maybe I was supposed to be thinking maybe this is my fault, you know.
Okay, let's hear from your parents. The father was,
Yeah.
okay, what was it like to have your child on your side all the time?
She was getting in the way of the argument.
It got in the way?
Yeah.
Okay, so it didn't feel dandy, it felt...
No, I guess I was happier than if she'd been on the mother's side. But in terms of just getting like trying to get across to my wife, like to stop what she's doing,
Okay,
she got in the way.
okay, and you were the mother? Who was the mother? Yeah, so...
I didn't like that.
What's that?
I didn't like that she wasn't on my side.
Right, it felt not right.
Yeah, like I want a coffee home.
Okay. Now the child here was, and your, okay, what was the child's role in this family?
Act like a very anxious child.
Like what?
Very anxious child.
Okay, he's an anxious child. What else do you think I told him? Do you think I told him just to be anxious?
Sort of get pulled into the argument between the parents.
Okay, and what did I tell you?
You told me that when you see either parent weak in the conversation, pick their side. In other words, back the side that's weak in the conversation.
Right, the role was, and you see that made you seem anxious, right? In other words, what came out was that you were not happy. But the role was, whenever you see one of them down, support that one. And when the other is down, then support that one. So naturally, you sounded pretty confused about turning the light on or off. You kept changing your mind, but you weren't changing your mind, you were doing your business. But it felt like you were very anxious because you had to follow all the time. And the father was, yeah, and what was that role like for you? What was it like for you having a child?
I felt like he was on my side, and then he changed his mind. I said, "What's going on here?" I said, "What's going on here?"
Well, when he changed his mind, what?
I said, "What's going on here?"
What's going on here?
What's going
So,
on?
okay, but did you notice that the way to get him on your side was to lose?
I didn't notice that.
Right. But that's what it was, right? In other words, when you felt he was losing, that's when you supported him. And what did you feel like with this?
Well, like I said before, when he was on the father's side, I felt very vulnerable because I didn't want to triangulate him
Right.
to what was clearly. When he switched, I think I did say, well, you know, he wants the lights on, so.
Right.
Off, excuse me.
Right. In other words, when he was there, that was you used it.
I didn't notice that those were instructions. I wouldn't have guessed.
Right. So you see, in this case, you thought he was more on your side because apparently you were more down trying to argue with a lawyer. And so he got to your side more. You felt he was a little less on your side because you were actually being stronger and less down. So his role was to support whoever's down. But whenever father started to feel better, he would switch, and that would confuse you, right? And then you didn't want to use it, but you kind of used it, right? Because it's hard not to. Okay, now there were some observers who weren't in the play. What was it like observing it? Everybody was engaged in one way or the other. Here we had two observers. Aside from the humor, what else?
I would just like, they're really not talking to each other in a way. And I was, yeah, I thought they weren't talking to each other, and the kid, I felt like he just needed a hug when they go over and hug him.
Okay, in other words, you felt that he was, see, Abi also, behind him, there's something anxious, something we can rev it up and say, not just anxious, horrible. Right, okay, and you see?
I felt like everyone was kind of stuck in their roles, so there was a lot of circular back and forth. And no one, like kind of like wishes that no one was talking to each other, no one was realizing how stuck they were.
Right.
Very stuck.
Actually, they were all realizing they were stuck because they were trying to get out of the role all the time. I had to push them back in. But was anybody happy doing this? This wasn't a happy simulation, was it? Pretty miserable for everybody. So, so now we're going to try to understand, just before we go on, any other comments? Anything else that somebody experienced that you want to say, well, this is what it was like? Okay, good. So, yeah.
My experience as a child, there's a lot of mixed messages about, get involved, stay out, get involved, stay involved. There was very
from both parents.
From both, more than mom actually.
Right, because mom was actually saying, "I'm trying not to do this." Right. That's because mom was trying to be a developed mom, but we'll get your differentiation down one way or the other. Yeah.
I felt really small and disempowered when they're having a disagreement about what I need about the lights.
Right.
My opinion was totally negated, not even developed an opinion because they were just having strong opinions about what I should do.
Okay. So now we get one more layer of it, which is that actually the child who had the most power in these three simulations was this child, because he was always looking at who has less power, and he was the power broker in the family. But by being the power broker in the family, he's not there. They're talking about him, but he's busy not being him. He's busy being them and seeing the balance between them. And that was particularly miserable. Yeah.
It was actually, it was very intense. It felt for me very intense, not in a role, it just actually felt very intense.
Right.
To be always trying to balance the parents,
Right.
And if I don't know if you know this, but I know that they were first talking to each other, and I would pop in and say whatever I said. And then eventually they started asking me everything. They started asking me, so what do you want to do? And I was like, it's not my role. But I don't know that it all became now that I was the one who actually held the power really at the end of the day.
Right. So you see,
very, that was like, I just wanted to run away.
You wanted to run away?
Yeah.
Right. So in other words, the more a child has power and succeeds in having power, the less power they feel, because it's not about them. And it was hard for this particular child. That he had the most complicated role, so it was hard for him to be seeing which way is going which, right? So he had to be anxious, he had to be vigilant, right? And whenever it went one way, he had to say something. So at the beginning, he just would say, lights on, lights off, without any explanation. But it would shift the balance. And when it would shift the balance, then it was hard to resist saying, but he says he wants the lights off, right? Now, the only person who tried to compromise, and I have to say, usually it's everybody tries to compromise, because that's just like, let's get this over with, because everybody wants to get out of here. So to get out of here, you have to make a compromise. And what would be a compromise? There's space and there's time. And these two characters tried to reach compromises, and I kept saying, you're not done yet, but you were close to getting to a compromise. The compromise was, if you think about it, al-cheshbon. In other words, the child wasn't part of the compromise. You were trying to solve your own conflict and get it over with. The compromise was either in space. We had a space where you couldn't turn the lights on and off, so we just had to pretend. So the compromise was either some lights on and some lights off, or time. sometimes lights on and sometimes lights off. The leading compromise, which I had trouble making not succeed, was, look, we'll leave the lights on, I'll tell you a story, and then we'll turn the lights off. That was too dangerous, because the role was no compromise, so I had to push the father to say, no, 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 for some reason, no, that's not going to work, and then the child had to pipe in. So it's hard to avoid making compromises, but if you look at the compromise and say, is the compromise resolving the conflict? That compromise, would that resolve the conflict?
I think it did between us. It didn't with him, you're right. It
Right.
did with us.
In other words,
But since he seemed to be reacting to our conflict, there was a thought that it could be done.
right, it was too sweet a deal, as they say. So Gabi was inclined to say, all right, what's the big deal? So we'll have the lights on and then we'll have the lights off.
He agreed, it wasn't.
He agreed, so I said, you can't agree, right? In other words, it was hard not to get it to agree. But if he agreed, and you say, so the compromise, what was the compromise? The compromise is that we're splitting the kid in half, right? That's the bad side of the story with Solomon and the two women and the baby. We'll split the kid in half, and you'll take the first half and I'll take the second half. You'll take the first physical half, I'll take the second half. But the child is an instrument of a compromise. What's the difference between a compromise and a resolution of a conflict? Because I gave orders, no resolution of conflict. And if you think about it, you didn't resolve the conflict, you made a compromise. What would be the difference between resolution of a conflict and a compromise? People like compromises. People talk about compromises as if that's the way to go. If you can just compromise, everything will be fine. Compromise, compromise. So what's the difference between that, you guys had a sort of a compromise, and the resolution of a conflict? This is a hard question, particularly in the Middle East, particularly when rockets were falling not long ago.
Compromise doesn't address a person's inner
Sorry?
It doesn't address the person's inner feelings and emotions. It's a
Right.
practical solution that leaves it for the next one.
Right.
I think that compromising doesn't really take into account the other person. It's just about getting whatever I can and giving whatever I can for my own personal.
Okay.
Still walk away with as an individual. Without seeing the other person's perspective and taking something into it.
Right. What else?
No one leaves happy after a compromise.
So?
No one's happy after a compromise.
No one's happy after a compromise. Are there terms that we've learned?
This regulation, it's not complicated.
Thank you. The philosopher has spoken, right? But a compromise is regulatory. It's not intersubjective, and it's a way around the intersubjective work. Now, it could be a vehicle towards intersubjective work, but it usually is instead of intersubjective work. See, we weren't allowing any, things were dysregulated. When lights both have to be on and off in the same family, in the same room at the same time, things are not regulated. So the compromise creates a regulation, but it doesn't create, what's missing? Intersubjectivity, right? In other words, that's what W saying. It doesn't take into account the other person. In other words, I haven't understood you. I don't care why you want the lights on. I don't care why you want the lights off. I actually don't care whether it's good for him. Let's just stop this and cut it in half. Yeah.
But ultimately, it often does lead later on to just the fact that you're able to.
Right. So
there's a saying in law that a good compromise is when both parties are not happy. Because later on, what happens is you just forget about it. You know, it all looks ridiculous to begin with.
Right. Well, you know, law is regulatory, right? And when you get to the issue of where does intersubjectivity enter into law, so you heard a whole 4 sessions about where the child is either regulated or becomes a person in the law. In most situations, the law regulates something about the child and fails to see him as a person with a side. The UN Convention on Children's Rights, was that talked about? The UN wrote a convention in 1989, Israel signed it in 1991, one of the first places to sign it, and ratified it. America signed it and didn't ratify it. It has never been ratified. Children do not have rights in America. One of the only developed countries that has refused consistently to adopt children's rights. In Israel, it's adopted, but it's very poorly implemented. But the rights of a child include participation in anything that that involves the child. So, for example, here we had the child. See, it didn't have to start with the lights on or the lights off. It's good for the child or not. The child piped up because that was his role. He saw, or I gave him the role, that when things are dysregulated, he's the regulator. The child becomes a regulator. And if the child is a good regulator, then the parties actually don't see that it's really about the child being wiped out. So nobody asked in the conversation, oh, right? This didn't happen. You were trying to be a good mother, but even so, this didn't happen. You didn't say, you know something, how about the two of us take a break from this idiotic conversation and ask what the light does to him? Because he keeps changing his mind. Maybe he's confused. Let's find out the intersubjective aspect of what the light is for you. That's what was missing, right? That couldn't be taking place because the child wasn't thinking about himself at all. So by being the power broker of regulation, he becomes erased intersubjectively. When you become the broker of regulation, you take the risk of erasing intersubjectivity. You see, if the conflict is a high conflict, so what happens is let's just stop the conflict, and then the people who do law would like to say, and this is part of divorce mediation, which is something you'll learn about after we learn about divorce in the middle semester next year. Divorce mediation oftentimes is just regulatory. Try to reach a compromise. There's somebody in the state whose job is supposedly to say, is this a compromise that helps the child? Is the child as a person involved in it, and is it something that works for the child? Hardly ever happens. Usually if it's a high conflict, if you reach a compromise, everybody is happy except the child, and then the conflict continues. A good situation would be where you reach a compromise, and then, whew, now we can talk. That would be wonderful, right? In other words, what lawyers would like to believe is that once you reach a compromise, then you stop fighting, so you've reached regulation. If you recall, regulation is not a bad thing. Oh, the philosopher is spoken, right? Now that we've reached regulation, now we can go to intersubjective. Does that happen naturally? If it did, we wouldn't be having this course because all of us would be out of business.
It happens between nations.
What's that?
It happens between nations in geopolitics.
In real politics.
They talk the talk, they can never get anything.
Right, it happens between nations, hopefully. There are all sorts of examples which work and which don't work. When I used to work, and I used to work for many years with Israeli and Palestinian teachers, there were moments when we were able to get from regulation to intersubjectivity, but not many. And the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is part of the State Department, adopted the program and brought us people who were experienced with places of conflict. Conflict, right? North Ireland, Macedonia. At one point we had conversations with somebody from Belgium. So the Belgian ambassador to Israel said to us, I don't think it's doable. He said, look, when Belgium decided to divide, compromise, right? Space, compromise, that there were the Walloons, they speak French, and there were the more Dutch people, and let's just have separate parliaments and then it's going to work out. He said to us, it doesn't work out. We still hit each other. It didn't develop. We put up walls. You've heard of walls, right? So we put up a wall. This wasn't a physical wall. We put up a wall, and nothing grew out of it. We just turned our backs on each other. The people in North Ireland in that conflict said, well, we've been working on this for an awful lot of years, and we don't understand how you can sit in the room with each other, because we couldn't sit in the room with each other while people were still fighting. We just couldn't do it. We just, fought with each other. So we think that you're 3 steps ahead of us, but we don't understand it. But for us, it took decades and a generation and a half or 2 of suffering before the people who finally reached something like a compromise had forgotten what it was about, because they were the grandchildren of the people who started the conflict. And sometimes, so sometimes it works better, sometimes it doesn't work so well. In families, compromise is a dangerous matter. It's a dangerous matter. In other words, a therapist who's pulled towards compromise has to remind himself that I may be doing regulation and impeding what we call therapy. Therapy is all about intersubjectivity. It needs to achieve a regulation at first, but if it stops at regulation, what doesn't go up when you're busy with regulation? Differentiation, right? See how it goes together? In other words, if you have a conflict, and you will see only families in conflict, the only families who will come for help have a conflict that they can't resolve. So they come to us and they want us to do two things, one of which they know and the other that they don't know. The one that they know is they want to regulate down. They want to calm it down. And they want perhaps to free a kid who's anxious and not be able to go to school. You, for example, might not be able to go to school because you never know when they're going to start fighting about the lights. So you better be there to regulate it, because if it goes off too much tilt one way or the other, things might break apart. So our child who's balancing it is actually keeping the couple together, isn't he? He's providing a regulation that they're not able to do. And then they start to think about the whole thing is about him. So it has to be about him. So he stays at home and regulates. We start usually with some kind of a regulatory kind of function, but we have in mind beyond what the client has in mind. A therapist always has in mind something more than what the client can see. And that's not a bad thing. But there are people who say that's a bad thing because that's chauvinism or who are you to decide for them. You know, the sort of stuff that is common these days and has its place. But it's impossible to treat a client and not wish for them more than they wish for themselves. It's a way of saying they probably can be better than they believe in themselves. And this whole conflict is based on the fact that they don't believe in themselves. They don't believe. See, I didn't let anybody here believe in themselves. You guys had trouble accepting it, but you don't believe in yourself if you say, I can't compromise. Why can't you compromise, right? Sure?
I mean, our group didn't necessarily take the compromise approach. We took the avoidant approach of saying, I'm out of here. I'm going to get a coffee. I don't care if you want the water on or off. I need my hot coffee, so I'm going to Starbucks, and that's where the hottest coffee is.
Who did that?
In our group.
The mother or the father?
Father. So it was interesting, they didn't even enter into the compromise stage. They were in a lower level of saying, I'm not even dealing with this.
Right, so you see what the child, because the child has a problem. Now, in your group, I think there's maybe a miscommunication, which usually is useful. What I had wanted was that the child would be sick one way and sick the other way.
No, my group was that the child always has to align with the father.
Was allied?
Was aligned with the father.
Okay. So then at some point there just was, there was nothing else to do. Okay? So we'll get to the alliance in a minute. And in Dina's group, who was the child? Right. And you were happy when the light was on?
What I understood was to be act one way in the dark and act the other way.
Okay. It was supposed to be, this is, the question is how things are communicated, that you're supposed to be sick one way and sick another way. The people, that would have been harder, right? So you didn't choose to do that, but maybe, the difficulty, because that's where you got a psychosomatic child. You see, the child, when the light is on, I have a migraine. That's what usually comes up in this exercise. And when it's off, I have an anxiety attack. So the mother turns the light off, and the child says, I'm frightened. So the father turns the light on, and the child says, I have a migraine. Now what are we going to do, right? Get the emergency room.
Get a night light.
What's that? What?
Get a night light.
Night lights are compromises, aren't they, right? And in the real world, if the father and the mother could say, we could figure out a light that's half on and half off, but we better find out if that works for our child. And if the child says to himself, that's a compromise, they're going to fight about something else, I'd rather have them fight about the light and the dark. They say, now I have an anxiety attack and a migraine, right? And then things, you see, they go on in the sense that it preserves. Regulation is a way of preserving. Yeah, all right.
Are we as humans programmed to want to find a solution? Because I feel like we all wanted to find solutions. Like we didn't want to be stuck, any of us.
Right. We're programmed. See, now, what do you guys think? Let's take that as a serious question for us to stop and think together. Are we as human beings programmed? Do you put it in your words?
are we programmed to always want to find a solution? Because
Right.
like, for me, it's like, when you hear that, you just think, well, there must be a solution. So, I don't know, it's hard to just be stuck in one.
Okay, so let's think out loud.
I think we're programmed to be comfortable, and if we're in a situation that causes discomfort, we might find a solution.
Right, in other words, at the level of regulation, yes.
We don't like conflict. We don't like conflict. We need to create oneness, connection.
Okay, so not having conflict and having connection are two separate levels, and they often get spoken of together. In other words, a family says, well, we're all together in this. And you know the scene in The Lone Ranger? You know this one? You weren't brought up in The Lone Ranger, you didn't see the second time. Tonto is the Indian. This is all the American racism. And he helps the Lone Ranger. And at some point, the Indians surround the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And the Lone Ranger says to Tonto, Tonto, how are we going to get out of this one? And Tonto says, what do you mean we, white man? No, that's, you have to apologize for a joke like that because it's obviously racist, right? That you can't trust the other people. So take it with the humor and don't take it with the social context. But yeah.
I'm wondering, because of you mentioned with the countries, how that works differently than families. You mentioned a country like Belgium that they've both decided to have their compromise. They're going to have, each is going to have their own parliament. What happened in the meantime, right now, the Arabs are coming in and they're starting their own party. And they might, do something there. So I think part of doing the compromise is once you both kind of just, like with the regulatory, we're just going to do our own thing, you're allowing another entity to come in. And I think when you're saying about families wanting to stay together, they're not really trying to do anything, they just don't want that other entity involved. Okay, so now Shandy is saying something interesting, which is when we say we has a boundary around it, and it has a function from within it. Remember Mediation, right? So the function within the we is intersubjective, or at least we hope that it would be intersubjective. We still haven't given an answer to Maria's question whether people really want intersubjective, or that's some sort of fantasy of Martin Buber. We'll get to that. But the other thing is the boundary around the system, right? And there are two kinds of systems. There are closed systems and there are open systems. A closed system never works. Totalitarian states are closed systems. A closed system says everything that has to be settled can be settled inside. Okay, so you intend to send your kid to school and he doesn't like the teacher. How are you going to solve that inside? Right? In other words, the world is open. No family is a closed system, but often families would like to feel that if they can compromise enough and regulate enough, they can remain a closed system and not have, God forbid, the state or the school come in and muddle in. But a lot of times what happens when a kid comes to therapy, oh, therapy. Are you guys relatives of the family? If you're relatives of the family, you're not going to treat them, right? So when a family comes to treatment, the system has opened, right? And that's why people both come and run from therapy, right? Because we open the system. Now, there's something which we'll learn later that's called induction into the system, where we start to act like the system, and then the system closes up again and acts like itself, and so does the therapist, right? Because if you think about it, when a couple comes in and starts, you're learning about this now with Dr. Levitz, when a couple comes in with conflict, there are therapists who side with one side and try to regulate it. There are therapists who try to balance it. Father's down, mother's side, mother's down, mother's side, right? And they call that therapy. And there are therapists who get sick both ways. They just, they want out from this family. They take it on themselves. They're feeling bad this way, they're feeling bad that way. And then there's Dr. Flashman who goes the opposite way.
What?
And then there's Dr. Flashman who takes the opposite.
No, it's not just Dr. Flashman. The Dr. Flashman has been in all of those roles, believe me, and it still happens. In other words, and it's for Shandy too, not just for Dr. Flashman. The point where the therapist turns is where the therapist says, I know I'm acting not like myself. I know that I'm not doing what I was taught to do, so I suppose I'm being inducted into the system. Is that a bad thing? It's a learning thing.
I mean, if you know about it. In other words, if you're inducted in the system and say, oh, I think I understand why their 15-year-old was hospitalized yesterday, because I'm starting to feel like her, right? I can't eat either, right? Because the conflict makes and so forth. So to be inducted into the system is not a bad thing. That's the way you learn. It's the same thing as transference in individual therapy. Transference at first, when Freud saw it, he said, I'm out of here. I don't want all this drama. Freud was not into drama. He said, you know, this is a bad thing. Then he said, oh, wait a minute. There's something to learn here. Because what's going on in the room is transferred from what goes on elsewhere. So how am I really going to know what's going on elsewhere? By feeling it, by the countertransference, by what it feels like to be in this system. This is a system with a single client. In a family, you start to act like somebody and say, oh, okay, I think that's why this girl can't eat. But then, oh, then you know. Then you know something you can't know until you've experienced it. So it's not a bad thing. But in principle, the family is worried that we're opening the system. Families have a certain kind of fantasy that it's possible to live in a closed system. And different cultures have different boundaries around cultures. One of the interesting multicultural issue that we're dealing with here is what's the issue of closed and open boundaries, closed and open systems in the Haredi world? Something to think about. You know, does the Torah create a closed system, an open system? Is it about the whole world? Is it about just the Jewish world? These are things that people have been talking about for thousands of years. So there isn't only one answer, but each aspect, you know, Jews go and want to be too open and they disappear. Jews want to be too closed, they sometimes also disappear. How do you live with the open, what's open and what's closed, and how do you work with it? That's one of the interesting questions which when we see Haredi families, we want to say they're worried about opening the system. But on the other hand, all systems are open. What's the fantasy? You know, you can't, even if your family is 150 people, you still, that's not your whole world. There are schools, there are neighbors, and there's other people around. So therapy always opens the system, and then there's this interesting matter of what we do with the conflict in the system. But now we get back to, I don't want to lose Maria's question. So are people programmed to want regulation? Oh, that's for sure, right? All you need is what Abby said, anxiety. As soon as you have anxiety, you want to get rid of that. You want it to go away. And you'll look for a shortcut, right? So you'll try to regulate yourself down. One way of regulating is what Shira was saying, is to just go and get a coffee. Get out of here, right? That's one way of regulating. Another way, that isn't a way of keeping it closed, it's a way of opening it, the Starbucks. There isn't any Starbucks in Israel. Israel has such good coffee that nobody was interested in Starbucks. So it came and it left, no Starbucks. But that's a good sign.
But then there are some people that just love conflict.
Okay.
Like as a nation also, I think there are people in Israel and on the Palestinian side who wouldn't know what to do with themselves if there was no conflict. It's like, it's in their identity.
Right.
Not everyone, but I do think that there are people.
Well, here we are in the Middle East. We're not going to solve the Middle East right now because you don't solve anything at the time when you're under attack. When you're under attack, this door had to be opened because this is the miklat, right? So when the miklat is, that's what we say in the South, when the miklat is open. Except that now the miklat is open all the time, except the building where my office is, where the neighbors are fighting about the territory in the miklat, so they keep it locked during the war, because they have such conflicts with each other. That's not a good regulation. But none of them are going to see this video.
Let's hear what yes, should, like I say, okay.
How do you go to intersubjective?
Right.
Right, isn't that our question? Now the first question is, why would you go to intersubjective? Like, do people want intersubjectivity? Is that good for them? Is it some fantasy that therapists want to impose on them, which would be a cross-cultural red card? You know, you don't do that to people. You don't say, no, you have to be more differentiated. Do people do better with the higher level of differentiation? Does it make them feel that the function on the inside of the subsystem of the family is working better, and therefore the boundary doesn't have to be so close because it's working well on the inside? Now, nobody agrees about that, right? In other words, you'll look at most systems of therapy today, including CBT, and you'll see that the issue is not how you relate to people or mutuality. Maybe yes, maybe no, who cares? The issue is if you have a symptom, you can overcome the symptom by finding a better way of regulating it with insights, and insights are also regulations, right? But are you trying to live better with other people? The only place where that's relevant in therapy, where it has a place that's relevant, that's given privilege, is family therapy. That's why family therapy is a challenge. That's why it's always been a challenge from the beginning.
Can you just repeat that, please?
What's that?
Can you just repeat that, please?
For the microphone?
For this microphone.
The only place where the way that you live your life with other people is given privilege, is under the focus, and that's important, how you relate with other people. The only place where that is given major privilege is family therapy, and probably in group therapy as well, because you're dealing with how you are in the experimental laboratory. But we don't, in family therapy, we don't have an experimental laboratory. We have reality. We have people's husbands and wives and children. That's not a laboratory. That's their reality.
Couples is not.
What's that?
Couples you wouldn't count into how people...
As part of family therapy.
Oh.
Yeah, as part of the people who work with couples were family therapists. So we're a little bit strange that way. And if you start to mumble to somebody, who's asking what on earth you're learning, you'll find it a little hard to explain and very difficult to justify, right? Because you'll say, well, we have this idea that when people co-create, they feel much more human. That's an important part of human experience, and by then you've already gotten this, that, and this, right? What kind of nonsense is that? That's not what people are about. But that's what we're talking about.
So would it be proper to say that it's about what we're learning is about relationship as how they relate to other people?
Yeah. Yeah. That would be a good way to put it. And particularly, how do we relate to people in our families? Because that's the central part, that's the training ground that determines how we relate to other people as well. Except where it's like this in the family, so you go to the yeshiva and have a better time there, But the idea is that it belongs in the family, because that's where you're raising your children. That's where you're showing children what human relationships are about. So the answer to Maria's question, do people really want that? Is it's a machloket.
But that's not solutions.
What isn't the solution?
Maria said that they look for solutions.
No.
That's different than what you're talking about. You're talking about co-creation.
Co-creation is the solution. That's exactly the point.
Right, but not a...
What?
It may not be a resolution to a problem. It may still be conflict.
Oh, and what happens when something is dealt with intersubjectively is the problems disappear. Because...
Eventually.
What?
Eventually.
Intersubjectivity also happens eventually, right? But I'll give you an example. There's divorce mediation, which you'll learn about next year. And the first doctorate on divorce mediation was written at the Hebrew University, in Hebrew, sorry, but you can find it if you really want to learn good Hebrew, by a woman who had been taking this kind of course, who was my student. And she said, I think there's two levels of divorce mediation. There's divorce mediation of regulation, and there's divorce mediation of intersubjectivity. And it's not wise to shtup them together. They're different levels, and it would probably depend on the level of differentiation of the couple that's divorcing, whether they need first regulation, or whether they're able to go to intersubjective understanding, and you're impeding them by making compromises instead of understanding them. So that's, she got her doctorate, and the rest is, so what? So she said it, but she said it. So that, you see, that's where, when we see conflict, we have this peculiar view about it, right? A peculiar view, instead of the natural view, the first step of regulation, which is conflict, oh my God, let's quiet things down. We say to ourselves, is it possible to first quiet it down and then move to intersubjectivity. Can we use the conflict as a way of understanding? Can we take this child's distress, or this child's distress, or this child's distress, and understand the distress as a way of looking also at how the conflict works? Sure?
Yeah, it makes me think of, I think there was a question on the blog about process versus content. And this, I think, is along the same lines in terms of the lights. The lights on and off is really just the content. That's what's being brought to us. Of I want it off, he wants it off, on, and it's the back and forth. And we could spend the whole session trying to make a compromise and regulate, but if we can get to the piece of the why or where it's coming from, that can bring more empathy and understanding, and then to a more intersubjective place.
So she was reminding me I have a whole lecture to give, so we should move on to it. And that's what the lecture is about. In other words, the issue is not the light. That's not the issue. So what is the issue? What could be the issue that's standing behind the issue of the light? Now, this was, here you are. This is your simulation. Father says lights on. Mother says lights off. Right? And this looks like a complementary. Now, one way of looking at it is the issue is control, right? And now what would the issue of control be? That's not the issue of the lights. The issue is who's in charge, who has power, who decides, who has more power over who. And is there, if we think about the parents or the alter egos, anybody think that the struggle was about control in the family? Yeah. Your family is about control? Also? Yeah. No. Good. It wasn't about control, right? So one issue is control. Now that means that the father feels that if I give up my control, I'm worthless, right? That's what it's about. And the mother feels that if I give up my control, I'm worthless. So they're struggling over survival. That's what people struggle over. Emotional survival. In other words, can I maintain my sense of power in the world, which is not a small issue. It's not the only issue, but it's one important issue. And that's one level of conflict, right? But
usually, doesn't it usually stem from fear?
Everything stems from fear. The question is which fear?
Might be worthless, might be helpless.
I'm afraid of what? I'm afraid of losing control. That's one fear. I could be afraid of two more things that we're about to see. So it's obviously about fear, but if we want to be intersubjective, we want to say fear of what? Right? What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of my wife? Why did I not? Why should I be afraid of her? I'm not afraid of her. I'm afraid of losing a sense of control.
Losing a sense of self?
What's that?
Losing a sense of self.
Well, the sense of self will be number 4. We'll get there. But right now we're talking about control.
Well, what is control? Isn't control a sense of self?
Right. Gabrielle's raising a very important question, which is, whenever we deal with one emotional issue, it tends to slide into the other ones. They're never completely separate. And there's also a tendency sometimes to reduce one to another. For example, you say, okay, if there's control, but if I lose control, then I lose a sense of self. Well, talk to your client and see. So there are clients who say it's about sense of self. But the other clients will say, I'm fine, but I can't be weak. Weak is what speaks to me. You see, because we want to talk the language of the client and not necessarily reduce it to something more abstract. So you're right that you may somebody, look, I'm afraid of losing control. Well, what are you afraid of? When I don't have control, I feel like it's not me. Bingo, you've hit a sense of self, right? But another client will say, I'm afraid of losing control because I like control. I need to be functional. I need to have control. They say, well, do you feel a loss of self? I say, what are you talking about? That's your problem, not my problem. I feel that I can't lose control. So we want to be careful. One of the reasons we're talking about this is so that we adjust ourselves to the language of our clients. You know, there are people who will say, I need the light on because otherwise I feel powerless. There are other people who say, I feel erased from the world. Those are different people. They're not the same. So one is control.
I'm having a hard time differentiating.
We'll get to it in a second. We'll get to it in a second. The second one is that I lose my self-respect, right? In other words, the issue is one of respect. How can it possibly be that I want the light on and that's disrespected? And so there are some cultures and some families where respect is the major thing, not control. Are you respecting me? If you respected me, you usually say it a little like if you respected me, you would let me keep the light on. How can you not respect me? And why do you want to have the light off? When I want it on, you have to respect me, right? So there's a problem with respect. So what are you losing? You're not losing a sense of self, you're losing the sense of self-respect, right? In other words, in Hebrew we would say kavod atzmi. It's a self-respect in the sense that how is it possible that she can't respect the fact that I want the light on? She's not respecting me. How is it possible he's not respecting my need to turn the light off? He's not respecting me. So the issue in the conflict, that's what Shira was raising, the process is a struggle over, in this case, respect, not control. And there are families who will use that language, right? So the content is the light, or the kid, or the school, or the teacher, or the grandmother, but the process is we're in a struggle here over respect. And the third would be love, closeness. That's a different family altogether, which is if you can't let me keep the light on, you obviously don't love me, which is different than you don't respect me, which is different from you don't give me any power in the world. Are they all, do they flow together? Oh yeah, people are people. But you want to listen to your clients and say, what is the process? What is the major issue here? And then number 4, which is not in the slides, is that I feel that I lose myself, that I'm erased. You see, that's another one. It's a different clinical issue.
The race one is that about you don't care about me. You don't care about me because if you would care, you would do that and then I would exist.
Right.
Is that the care is exist?
But you see, care is a complicated word. It's a complicated word in English. As you know, it's a very complicated word in German. Sorge. Go figure out what that means. It's a major player in Heidegger's philosophy. Nobody knows what he had in mind. But Heidegger, this ex-Nazi, a major player in his, they didn't know how to translate it. Sometimes it's translated as care. But if you think about care and listen to it, some people will say, you don't care enough to give me power. And somebody else will say, you don't care enough to love me. And another person will say, you don't care enough about my respect, right? In other words, care tends to be...
About my existence, which is powerless.
What?
Or you don't care enough about my existence.
My existence, that would be Gabrielle's. Exactly, right. So care is like the word upset. And when therapists hear the word upset, they say to themselves, I have a little work to do here to understand what on earth this word means, right? Because there are general words, upset is one, care is another, which need to be, you need to put the magnifying glass on them and to understand that it says something, but it needs to be specified more. In other words, if you have a couple and say, if you cared about me, you'd let me put the light on. You still need to say, okay, so what kind of caring do you lose when she turns the light off? Do you lose caring of your control, of her loving you? Well, let's just try to get a better sense of what the struggle is, right? So care would be a more general word. It's a very useful question, because a lot of times your clients will speak in code. Every family has its own code. And usually the codes are the words that are not identifiable. In other words, they're regulatory more than they're intersubjective. When you get to love, when you get to control, when you get to respect, you're getting closer to what a person really feels. That's closer to the process. Care tends to be a marker for something that more care, less care, more care, less care. What kind of care are you talking about? So there are different levels of abstraction. Care is more general, I think. You agree with that, or is that different in your families? Huh?
Sure.
Okay.
If you would care about me,
right,
then you would leave the light on because I need it on, because that's how I can feel better.
Feel better is a very general term. Feel better about what? about being loved, about having control, about being existing.
Secure is one of them.
Right? This is an important clinical point, so it's good that you're bringing it up. Now, a lot of times what happens is the person will say, if you would leave the light on, I would know that you care about me. And the therapist feels something, right? That's why we did the alter ego part of it. In other words, you say, it feels to me like love, right? But then you use that and you say to your client, if we would substitute that and say, I would be more sure that you love me, would that be what you mean? Would that be a way that you would put it? And the person, no, I know she loves me. Oh, well, how about that? So would it be perhaps that you would give me control because you know that I need to have some sense of power in the world? Ah, that's it, right? Or no, what are you talking about? It's respect. Okay, so, and I'll just give you one little hint. If you want to help somebody to say the truth, feed them something wrong. Because the average human response among Israeli males, it's absolute, but among most people it's there, is they say, mapito, right? So you say to somebody, you would lose respect? What? What are you talking about respect? I have plenty of respect, but she doesn't love me. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, now we'll just go on. So making mistakes is often a very useful thing. It helps, it can sound like manipulation. You can say that it's, birthing. It helps something to move along. As long as you don't get stuck in saying, no, I said that it's not respect, so yeah.
I'm having trouble with the respect theme because I feel like, unless I just don't get it culturally, I feel like somebody who's demanding respect, really underneath that there's some kind of feelings of, lack of self-esteem.
There's a fragility, right.
Insecurity or worthlessness.
Right, that's the process. If you don't give me respect, kind of like I don't feel it myself. You're responsible for it. Why? Because it's weak inside of me. If you don't give me love, I don't feel that it's there. Why? Because it's weak inside of me, self-love. If you don't give me power, because I feel weak. If you don't maintain my self-existence, I don't hold it myself because it's fragile. All of those processes, that's why we say to ourselves, nobody's doing anything wrong here. People are trying to survive. Trying to survive is not easy. As we say, schwer zu sein ein Jid. It's hard to be a Jew. It's harder to sein zwei Jid. It's much harder to be two Jews in the same place. What?
It's harder not to be a Jew.
It's hard enough to be a Jew, but you see, to be two in the same room and to manage to regulate and to subject. So that's what we're talking about. It's a matter of, but you see, if people say, I have to survive, well, people have to survive. That was Maria's first question. But that they want to survive alone and just, use everybody else to survive themselves? I don't think so. I don't think that's what people want. Sometimes they settle for it. That's Maria's second question. Okay. Those will be Maria's questions from now on. So everybody remember,
So we can have a power struggle in a family.
Right.
The husband means something completely else as the wife, but he thinks it's his respect and she wants her love. So he thinks that they're fighting about respect because he can only see his not feeling respect. She thinks they're fighting about love. Meanwhile, they're both...
Wonderful, right. So now, this, when you people become lecturers and start to teach family therapy, and somebody asks a question like that, you say, so now it's getting more complicated, so I guess that the first level, we understood each other. In other words, when I want respect and you want respect, that's a little easier. When I want love and you want control, how are we going to do that, right? And the answer is, you can't do it without intersubjective work. Because he's sure that she's thinking about respect. And she's sure that he's thinking about love. So you have to break it down to the differences between them. And then you go into, if you remember the complementary cycle, you would say, well, when you're feeling too little respect, how can she help you without losing her love, right? What can she do? So, well, he's disrespecting me. So I said, well, it's not about you, it's about him. Can you help him and not lose, you keep your plus and help him to get from minus to plus? You remember that little thing, right? How can you help her when she's feeling not loved? Well, but she's not feeling loved. What's this? She's disrespecting me. And so, okay, how about if we say that her need for love came before you? You didn't create her. That she came with a fragility, and she chose you, so maybe you could help her because it's not fragile in you. See, raising the interesting question of how people choose each other and what keeps people together. And that nobody has the answer to, but one way of looking at it, you didn't know you were raising it, is that people have different fragilities, right? And the other answer is that people have exactly the same fragilities. And you'll see couples like one, and you'll see couples like the other.
But then we still call it a power struggle, right? Even if one is not in a power struggle, but she wants power.
No, a power struggle is where both of them are struggling about power. You've gone beyond that. You've said, what if they're struggling with different issues?
And it's a lot in couples. Women usually want something else than men, usually. You're going to say that that's a stigma.
No. That apparently is your experience, right? No, that's a culturally bound statement. It could well be. It could well be that in your culture you find that men are raised to, that men want respect and women want love. Everybody knows about Mars and Venus? Right. Okay, so you all know that. So going beyond that, it's not always the case. As you know, aside from Mars and Venus, there's Mercury, and there's Jupiter, and there's Saturn. There's a couple of other planets out there. Listen, you know, it's not a bad place to start, because when you know, let's say Mars and Venus, you all know what that's about. So, okay, so when you're seeing a family, and the man seems to be from Mars, and the woman seems to be from Venus, so the therapist is happy because he understands something, okay. But now the therapist has to say, okay, now what do I do with it, which isn't in the book, right? And you could say to yourself, am I sure, or am I just hearing that because that's what makes me happy, because I can put that rubric on it, maybe there's something, maybe that's the content, but not the process? Things are more complicated than that, you know. But it's a place where you can put your feet and start to think, but it's not a place where you can stop thinking.
I'm still not convinced that not all of these things are based on the same thing.
A what?
You said survival, and we're trying to survive.
Right.
This guy calls survival love, this guy calls it respect, this guy calls it something.
Right.
But the person is trying to exist.
See, what Gabriel's trying to do is to get back to the loss of self. In other words, survival means that if I don't have the love or the control or the respect, I'm going to fall apart. That's not always the case. In other words, if you look at the sense of self can be diminished but not lost. And many people are in all sorts of difficulties, and they don't lose a sense of self. Losing a sense of self is a separate clinical issue. It was first recognized by Kohut, who we mentioned way back. Before that, it wasn't part of clinical discussion. It was part of theoretical discussion. Kohut put it in and made it more useful, but it's not. It also isn't always everything. Kohut didn't say it was always everything. He said that Mr. A, when his father wasn't being respected when he was 10, he started to lose a sense of respect. He didn't say that all of my clients are that way. He said some are, right? So we don't want to necessarily impose, it's a theory, you could reduce it theoretically, but we're not here to do theory, except in this class, we're doing maybe too much theory. But when you go into a session, you're not doing theory. You want to hear the words that the person says. You want to feel their vulnerability. You want to say, oh, when I feel lousy, what kind of lousy? When I feel good, what kind of good? And you don't want to choose one rubric. Some people may say, I just disappear, I fragment, I all fall apart, I can't even think. But not most people.
Maybe for one person to be diminished is equal to the other person's being nullified completely.
For some people. It's one thing that you'll find in clinical work, but not everything. You know, you don't want to reduce anything to one thing. It makes it easier to think, but it doesn't make it easier to work with people. Because there are people who let's say you say that instead of as a theory, you say it as a clinical statement to somebody. Say, maybe when you feel you lose control, you stop existing. There are people who say, oh, thank you, no one's ever said that. And that I finally understood what it is. And some people say, what are you talking about? I just need love. Don't you need love? What are you talking about? That isn't my language, right? So you want to be able to talk on different levels of language. So let's just go on a little bit. So we did 3 children, right? Who is this child? Actually, I gave it opposite to the slide. I had the child side with dad. The slide has it siding with mom, right? That was your group, right? Okay. So sometimes when you see that the child has 3 options. One option is to side consistently with one parent. What does that do to the conflict? It distracts it, right? Because they're no longer talking about their conflict, they're talking about the balance with the child. Many times, the child who is pulled into, not all times, but many times, when the child is pulled into an alliance, you call it a triangle, right? And a perverse triangle, because it crosses hierarchical boundaries, right? You know? Many times the child is brought into the role of siding consistently with one child when the issue, the process is one of control. In that family it was control, right? Okay, that was clear that was control. That's fine, it doesn't always work out that way in the simulation, it doesn't have to, but many times if you see a family and the kid is always siding with one, you say to yourself, I guess there's a process of control that's going on here. It's a good guess, it's not an answer, but it's a good guess. Here's the, this was, this child was, huh? This is the child who, yes, you're right. You're right. This was you, right? Now, many times when you see that the child is busy balancing, it's hard to balance control. Control sort of has to be one way or the other. But it's easy to balance respect, right? Just give more respect, give less respect. Did it feel to you like the issue was respect? You said it wasn't control. Did it feel to you like the issue was, when you say dad is down, it means he's losing respect, and mom is down? Don't force it. No, not really. Okay. But sometimes it is. Okay? So sometimes when you see that the child is choosing this role, the children choose the role for a split second, then they're stuck in it, right? When the child is in the role of balancing the two, many times the issue is respect, because they keep losing respect, but respect is more fluid than control.
I guess there's a feeling of the child that having to respect that parent.
What's that?
The child that having to respect that parent,
right.
Following, taking that side.
But in other words, he has to, that's what you felt following the, you know, how can dad be down? I need to respect him, so. And then the third child was in Dina's group, which is the illness of light and dark. And the child there, did it feel to you like maybe the issue was who loves each other? Not exactly. But you didn't actually have it.
Use the language of I love you more.
Huh? That came up more? Okay. When you see a child that seems to be pulling the whole conflict into himself, so now the only issue is how to save the child, and that's the content, but it's not the process. Many times you'll find that the issue is mainly one of closeness. And since they only had 3 possibilities, we didn't have the 4th. So you can just try to imagine what it'll look like when there's loss of self. Now, there's one last thing that I wanted to tell you.
This was also a loss of self, the closeness, the respect, where he didn't have a self, he was always...
Right. Everything is also loss of self in the eyes, in the view of a person who's looking at it. The question is how it's experienced. Right?
But you yourself said that he wasn't being able to express himself as a person.
Okay.
Express himself as a mother or father.
Right. Okay, that's particularly true here, that there's a loss of self. Okay, good. I agree. You follow what Gabriel's saying, that the child has abandoned his own voice and wanted to be busy with the balancing act.
So with an illness in the child, is that always an issue of closeness, you're saying?
It's what?
When a child develops an illness,
okay.
a symptom, is that always due to closeness?
Said always no.
No.
No,
it's just
I'm
an
trying to give you a sort of
Okay.
a hook to start to think, but not to stop to think. It's just a way of thinking, but I wouldn't, no one suggests that there's a one-to-one correspondence. What I'm going to do now is, I'm just going to tell you one last thing about psychosomatic illnesses. And then next week, read chapter 10 of the Family Crucible, if you haven't read it yet. That's about conflict. And then we're going to go over what we've learned about conflict in the Bryce family. Okay? And then we're going to break for Pesach in conflict. Let's start with Pesach as a reset, so we'll start everything over again. Minution, aside from being one of the first founders in family therapy, he actually he created one of the few areas of research. And he has a book called Psychosomatic Families, which you're all invited to have a look at. I think it must be in the library. And there he goes into a couple of illnesses in children. Chronic illnesses in children, the most common is asthma, second is diabetes, and third is epilepsy. And he was dealing with diabetic children, and he tried to say that there were some diabetic children who are normal children in normal families. You would say, well, the differentiation level probably supports them. They would, and they still have diabetes. They were children with diabetes who have behavioral problems, and there were children with diabetes who are psychosomatic. What does psychosomatic mean? It means when things happen in the family, the kids' glucose goes up and they go out of control and they get into the hospital. But it's related to what goes on in the family. It was sort of an indicator to what's going on in the family. So in brief, you can measure a certain change. Delta is always a change in the level of stress as an indicator of stress, which is the free fatty acids that are broken down by the release of adrenaline. If you study the change in the level that you can measure in the blood, these days we would probably just measure cortisol levels. In those days it was hard to measure that. You'll see that there are three kinds of families. The normal family, he took the parents into the room. You know, one-way mirror, like you guys do. You put them in the room and have them talk, just by themselves. And you measure the level of the free fatty acids in the child, right? The child is watching this. And then the therapist comes in and starts to mix it up. And you measure what's going on with the child. And then you bring the child into the room to meet with his parents. And then you take the child out of the room. So it makes perfect sense in the behavioral and the normal children that there's something that sort of goes up a bit when the child is in the room with his parents. So the stress goes up a little bit, and then the child leaves the room and the stress goes down. But in the psychosomatic families, the child watches the parents. When the therapist goes in, it goes up again. When he's with his parents, it goes up even more. And guess what happens after he leaves his parents? It keeps going up, right? So the fact that it keeps going up is a way of saying that the child is internalizing the stress of the parents, right? In other words, that being with his parents, with all of the children, there was a mild elevation. In other words, once the therapist was talking with the family, they were talking about differences, maybe differences close to conflict. So when the child is exposed to it, he's more stressed. But when he's out, right? But the psychosomatic child, when he's in, and when he's out, he's still in, right? Now, this particular piece of research is largely neglected. I think it's a very, very important piece of research, just to sort of imagine those children with asthma, let's say, who when they're with their parents and the parents have conflict about whether to go to the emergency room or not, right? But that's the content. The process is something else. So they're stressed when they're with their parents, but when they're out, right? But if these children internalize the conflict between their parents, then the asthma is going to get worse and worse. And then the interesting question will come up, okay, what created this situation? Because the simple way of thinking, which I don't think anybody here has a simple way of thinking, right? You would be learning family therapy if you were satisfied with this simple way of thinking. There's lots of easier things to do in the world than family therapy, let alone theory. The simple way of thinking is, well, they created the diabetes, they created the asthma. You see, these are parents who are at fault because they put their stress onto the child. That's too simple-minded. Another way of saying it is, this child has a propensity for, let's say, asthma, right? Now, the asthma challenges the differentiation of the parents because there's survival at stake, right? And so they become more fragile and they become less confident about love, about control, a lot of times about control with illness, or about respect. And so, dealing with asthma, the level of differentiation goes down, right? So it's not that the level of differentiation created the asthma created the level of differentiation. Now, this is important because a lot of times you see kids and you say, well, the family's at fault because the kid internalizes their stress, but actually their stress was created by the illness. In other words, before the child was ill, they were as good as you and I, because we want to, sort of have a sense of compassion for people who are dealing with an ill child. It's not easy. And so you say, well, what is the price on the family of dealing with the ill child? And those of you who will work at some point in medical systems will want to keep this in mind, that you want to know how were you before you had to deal with this. And if you hear, we talk to each other fine, but no longer, because they have this pressure of surviving. So that's where we're going to stop. We become experts in chapter 10 of the Family Crucible, and we will run the Grice family through the Crucible next week.